Afternoon, everyone. It's Rabbi Akiva, and I hope that you're well. Today is Wednesday, and it is the 6th of October, and I'm very glad that we could resume studying together. This is a real privilege. Okay, this week is Parshas Noach, and even though it's Parshas Noach, normally with Parshas Noach, we go ahead and with Parshas Noach, we look at Parshas Noach alone. But I'm not just going to look at Parshas Noach, because Parshas Noach, we know the protagonist in Parshas Noach is Noach. And Noach makes his first appearance at the end of last week's Parsha, at the end of Bereshis. So I want to start off today by looking at something fascinating about Noach that we saw at the end of last week's Parsha, at the end of Parshas Bereshis, that I was not familiar with prior to this year. When I was looking over Parshas Bereshis, I saw some Rashis caught my eye that I had not taken notice of in the past. When I saw these Rashis, I started looking into some of the commentaries, and I found some fascinating material about Noach and his family that I don't think I was aware of before. And that's what I want to start today sharing with you. So we're going to start today talking about Noach, the person. And Noach, the person, shows up, as I said, at the end of last week's Parsha, at the end of Bereshis. It tells us it's in Perek Hay, the 5th chapter, Pasuk Lamed Beis, verse 32. Noach ben chamesh me'os shana, and it was when Noach was 500 years old. Remember, at this point, and during the early days of mankind, people were having far longer lifetimes than what we're used to. So it was when Noach hit the ripe age of 500. Vayoled Noach, that's when Noach and his wife and Mrs. Noach, we know from other sources her name was Naamah. That's when they had their children. What were their names? As Shem, as Cham, as Yafes. So they have 3 sons, Shem, Cham, and Yafes. Rashi quotes a medrash, and Rashi points out to us that it was very odd for people of that generation not to have kids till they were 500 years old. Look, Ben Chamesh Me'os Shana, Noach was 500 when his children were born. Rav Yudan taught, Matam Kol Adoros. If you look at all the other generations that are listed in Parshas Bereshis, they all have their children when they're about 100 years old. And Noah didn't have kids till he was 500 years old. What happened? Why did he was like an anomaly? Everybody else is having their children at 100, and Noah doesn't have his till 500. So says this was intentional on the part of God. God made it that Noach didn't have his children until he was 500. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, God says, I know it's going to be a flood. Im Rishoimim, I don't know what kind of kids he's going to have. If they're wicked kids, Haim Yovdu B'mayim, Viral Sadik Zeh. If there's kids now at 100, think about it. There's in another 400 some odd years, there's going to be the flood. So then he's going to lose those kids, and all kids, they'll have generations of Noach's kids will be lost, and they'll be so broken. I can't do that to Noach. He's the righteous man. So therefore, I can't let him have kids now because they might be wicked. But on the other hand, if they're going to be righteous and they deserve to be saved, I should burden Noach with the task of building a whole armada, a whole fleet of arks. It's hard enough he's got to build one ark. But if he's going to start having kids 400 years prior to the flood, if they're going to be righteous, then them and all their descendants, he's going to have to build this whole fleet. That's so difficult. So therefore, Kavash is Mayano. Therefore, God, so to say, suppressed his fountain, made it that he wouldn't issue children. And that's why Noach didn't have kids till he was 500 years old. So that was the oldest of all of his kids, to make it that he would not be worthy of being punished prior to the flood. Because it's written a pasuk from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah. It's like a rhetorical question. For the youth, it's a statement. For the youth who's 100 will be held accountable, will die. Meaning someone under 100 years old at that point in history would not be held accountable. And this means at the age when it'll be punished in the future. So he says, this was the step before the Torah was given. people weren't held accountable for their crimes until they were 100 years old. So therefore, Hashem says the following calculation, according to the Medrash, is that Noach, really, the whole generation's having kids at 100 years old or so. I don't want Noach to have kids that early. I'm going to make him wait an extra 400 years. Why? Because both sides are going to be problematic. If the kids are wicked, then not just those kids, but all their descendants, everyone's going to get wiped out with the generation of the flood. And that'll be so heartbreaking for Noach. I can't put him through that. But on the other hand, if they're going to be righteous, and he's going to have these a huge amount of descendants, when the flood comes, he's going to have to build a whole fleet of ships, and that's too much work. I can't put him through that. Therefore, what'll I do? I'll delay him having kids till he's 500 years old. That'll make it that the oldest of his kids, who's going to be Yefes, won't even be 100 years old. And as what God says in Isaiah, at that point, before Matan Torah, before the Torah was given, people were not fit to be punished until they were 100. Therefore, any way it goes, whether they were righteous or not, he's not putting Noach through a difficult ordeal, because even if they're wicked, they won't be punished. And if they're righteous, okay, you'll only have to build one ark. That's, according to the Medrash, that's the explanation of why God manipulated things to make it that Noach would not have children until he was 500 years old. That's a very puzzling Medrash that Rashi quotes. But I want to share with you what some of the commentaries pick up on and what bothers them about this Medrash. There are numerous things that could bother them, but I want to share with you one question that I saw many of the commentaries ask. Let's see, I see it here. I first have the Sifsei Chachamim, one of the commentaries on Rashi, called the Sifsei Chachamim. So the Sifsei Chachamim asks this question, and he's honest. He says, it's not my question. I first saw it asked by the Maharam Yafi, Rav Moshe Yafi, who was the Lush. He was a contemporary of the Ramah. So he says as follows. He says, "Atriach alav lasos tevos harbe." If Noach and his wife would give birth to tzaddikim, how can I put him through this? The tzaddikim, they're going to have to be saved, them and all their kids. So then he's going to have to build a whole armada of ships, a whole fleet. It's going to be too much work. So look at this question that the Maharam Yafi asks. He says, "Adarabba," to the contrary. If he's got so many tzaddikim, if Noach gives birth to so many tzaddikim, he's 3 kids and their tzaddikim and their kids and their grandkids, if they're all righteous, if they really are going to be righteous, yoser me'asara, if you add them up, you're going to have a total of more than 10. Think about it. Noach and his family in the ark were how many in the Teva? It was Noach and Mrs. Noach, Nama, that's 2. And then he's got 3 sons, and they each have wives. So that's an additional 6. That means they were 8. So he says, but one second, if you would have let Noach had kids before the Mabul, before the flood, 400 years before the flood, they certainly would have been a number greater than 10. And if they would have been righteous, hayu maginim al kol ha'olam, their merits could have defended the whole world, and they wouldn't have needed arks because there wouldn't have been a flood. Where do we get this idea from? Where do we get this idea from that if there would have been 10, they could have saved everyone? Layla said it from Avram. And he says, Rashi himself says this later in Parshas Vayera. When God appears to Avram Avinu, and Hashem tells Avram, I'm ready to destroy Sodom, Amorah, and the surrounding cities, Avram begs for mercy. And Hashem says, the lowest number I'm willing to go to is 10. And what would have been if there were 10? That could have saved everyone. So the Maharam Yafi's question is that this Medrash quoted by Rashi doesn't make sense. Because the Medrash says if they would have been tzaddikim, what's the downside? He's going to have to build a whole fleet of ships to save everyone. But he says, no, he wouldn't. If they would have been tzaddikim and it was 400 years prior, you would have had more than 10. If you would have had more than 10, that could have saved everyone. There wouldn't have been a flood. So let's see how he says it. Sharei came Perish Rashi. Rashi himself comments later in Parshas Vayera. He tells you where it's in Yud Ches Lamed Beis, 1832. Gabe Tfilas Avram. When Avram Avinu davened for Sodom, Be'al Pachas Me'asara Lo Bikesh. So Rashi says, no, why didn't Avram go any lower than 10? Sharei Dora Mabul, because Rashi says, look at the generation of the flood. Ches Hayu, they were 8, because he had the 3 sons and their wives, and Noach and his wives. That's 8. They were tzaddikim. Ubenei Menashem Lo Etzilu, and they were not able to save everyone. Mashma, what does that imply? Avram recognized If there would have been 10, Noach and his family could have saved everyone. Why were they unable to do so? Because they were only 8. So that's why when Avram realized there's not even 10, he stopped davening, because 10 is the lowest number. But that implies that 10 could save everyone. So then what does Rashi mean? That if it would, quoting the Medrash, that if they would have had tzaddikim, now he would have had to build a whole fleet of ships. No, he wouldn't have. There wouldn't have been a flood. Good question. So look what he answers. So the Sisei Chachamim quotes another commentary on Rashi called the Tzeder Laderech, and he says, Yesh Lomar, here's the answer. The Asara tzaddikim, what could 10 tzaddikim accomplish? Lo sheyatsilu shelo yavu mabul klal. They wouldn't have caused it that there won't be a flood at all. Rak yatsilu al iram. 10 could save their locale. Again, what would have happened if there was 10 tzaddikim in Sodom? They wouldn't have saved the whole world. They would have saved Sodom. So 10 has the ability to save a locale. So if Noach and his family would have been more than 10, okay, you're right, they would have saved. But how much would they have saved? They would have saved their city, whatever city it was that the Noach family resided in. V'zeu sha'amar, and that's what the Medrash means when it says, Atriach lasos tevos harbe. They're going to have to build a whole armada of ships. L'chol yoshvei iram, because now the whole city is going to be saved. They're going to have to build ships for the whole city. But the mabul, the flood, will certainly come to wipe out the rest of the world. So this is how he answers for the Medrash, is that, yeah, if there would have been 10, they would have done a lot of saving, but they wouldn't have prevented a worldwide flood. They would have saved their locale, their city, their village, whatever it was that they lived in. So that's what they would have accomplished. You're right, and Avram learned from them. Yeah, 10 would have done that. But what would have happened? They would have saved their city. What would the result of saving their city be? The whole city needs tevos. So that meant Noach and his family would have had to build arks for their whole city, because the city didn't believe there's going to be a flood. The city didn't repent. So they're going to have to build, they would have saved their city, and they would have had to build arks for tevos for their whole city. That's why Hashem doesn't want to have him have kids 400 years earlier. Interesting answer. Very interesting answer. But what it helps us do is it clarifies what would have been accomplished with 10. Not that 10 would have saved the world, but 10 would have saved their locale. And that's what Avram realized when Hashem said there's not 10 that could help for Sodom. So what if there would have been 10? They would have helped Sodom. That's what they would have done. So it's not a steer. It's not a contradiction. Very, very interesting answer. That's one answer from the Sifsei Chachamim. Let's see another answer I saw. This is in a commentary on Rashi called the Divrei David. The Divrei David was written by Rav David ben Shmuel HaLevi. The family name he sometimes goes by is Siegel, but again, it's not like people had real last names. He lived in the 1600s rather. In the 1600s, it's not like people had surnames. So why was he called Siegel? Siegel was a very common name that was given to Levium. Sgan, Siegel was an acronym for Sgan Levi. He was an assistant to the more prominent Levi. Levium were all, and Kohanim are all from the tribe of Levi, from the Shevet of Levi, and Levium were assistants to Kohanim. So Siegel was an acronym for Sgan Levi. He is from the tribe of Levi, but he's an assistant, meaning he's not a Kohen. He's a Levi. That's what Siegel meant. One of the students that I have at the school is Benjamin Siegel, a son of Joel and Rachel Siegel. And I asked him the other day, I don't remember what the occasion was. We were giving out kibudim or something at the school, and I asked him if he was, it was Simchas Torah. And he was we broke up for minyanim, for everyone to get aliyahs. And I asked Benjamin, I said, just remind me again, are you a Levi? So he goes, no, I'm a fake Siegel. The family has the name Siegel, but they're not real Levium. The same way, just like everyone who's named Katz isn't necessarily a Cohen, or Cohen isn't necessarily a Cohen. So he was joking with me. He says, no, we're fake seagulls. We're not real seagulls. I just thought that was such a cute answer. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone say that before. But Rav David ben Shmuel HaLevi, he was a real seagull. And that was his last name. He's most famous for his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch called the Taz, which was an acronym for Turei Zav. So he's most commonly known and recognized for his halachic work, the Taz, that's in the Shulchan Aruch, but he also wrote a commentary on Rashi. And he was one of the leading rabbis of Polish Jewry in the 1600s. So Rav David HaLevi Siegel. So here it is that he wrote on Rashi called Divrei David. So I saw he's bothered by the same question. And let's see what he does with it. He says Ben Chamesh Mayos, so he quotes Rashi Vim Tzadikim, and if they end up being Tzadikim, Haim Atriach Alav Lasus Tevas Harbe. Nebuch, I'm gonna have to burden him with making so many ships, so many arcs. Come on, I can't do that. So therefore, I'm not having him have kids till he's 500 years old. He says, Rabim Makshim. Many people ask, meaning many of the commentators on Rashi asked the following question. Zahaim Harbe Tzadikim. I don't understand. If there would have been so many tzaddikim, lo tia gzeira, there never would have been this decree in the first place for destruction, for the flood. Sharei perish Rashi Eitzel Avram, because Rashi himself commented when Avram was bargaining with God to try to save Sodom, that Avram never let lower than 10. Sharei Gabe Noach, why did Avram never go lower than 10? Because he looked at Noach and he says, Lo etzilu al doram, they were not able to save their generation. Pachos me'asara, because they were less than 10. Mashma, what does that imply? The asara, that if they would have been 10, hayu matzilam. If they would have been 10, then they could have saved their generation. So that's the same question what the Sisei Chachamim said in the name of Maharam Yafi. So let's see how he answers it. Very different answer. Velo kashamidi, that's what that acronym is. Velo kashamidi, he says this is not a question. The whole gezerah, Shalonis kaima machmas haganas tzadikim. Whenever we have the concept that an evil decree, a decree of destruction, is not going to hit the world because of the protection of the tzaddikim, meaning let's say the tzaddik is there, he's holding up a shield that's protecting the world from God's decree of destruction. Al kopanim hagzeri kayemes lamala. It doesn't mean that the decree went away. The decree is still there, and it's trying to get at the world. Elashad tzadikim ma'atzrimoso. It's like the tzaddik is standing there holding a shield, fighting off that decree. So it's not that the decree went away. It's just that the tzaddik has the ability to stand there with the shield and deflect it. Shelo tered lamata. That decree of destruction should not come down and hit the world. The nafkamina, what does it mean if you view it this way? It's not that the decree went away. It just means that it's like it's temporarily deflected. What is that implication? If let's say for whatever reason the tzaddik's protection goes away, even a tzaddik sometimes could have a stumble. Let's say the tzaddik got up on the wrong side of bed in the morning and he made a mistake. He made a bad decision. He did an avera. So now he's not strong enough to protect the generation anymore. What happens? So now that evil decree of destruction that was really intended for the world, and the only reason why it hasn't hit the world till now is because the tzaddik was strong enough holding the shield and he was protecting everyone. But if that tzaddik should stumble, and every human being is a human, and as Shlomo HaMelech says in Tzaddik Baratz Asher Lo Yachta, there's no tzaddik who goes through life without making a mistake at some point or another. We're humans. That's just the way we are. So therefore, he says, what would happen? Eventually, even a tzaddik who's protecting the generation, there's a real likelihood that they could stumble. And once that protection is gone, what happens to that decree of destruction? It hits the world. So he says, Im Kain, therefore, even if Noach did have a large family, they still would have had to build a whole fleet of ships. He would not have felt confident relying on the fact that I'm here, I got my 10, and the world's never going to have a flood. He never would have felt that confidence. Why? Because he says, we might slip, and if we slip, boom, here it comes. Because maybe the protection will go away. Maybe me and my kids, sooner or later, at some point or another, mankind could slip. Who says we're going to be tzaddikim forever? I might be able to hold the fort. The first generation, my kids might be able to hold the fort, but who says the third, fourth generation is going to hold the fort? If there really is a decree of destruction that God issued on the world, it's not that, it's like, think about it this way. I'm thinking of those missiles that Hamas launches from Gaza, and Israel, Baruch Hashem, they have this Iron Dome system. So what happens? The Hamas guys launch their missiles, Iron Dome goes up and knocks it off. Are the people in Sderot still living in fear? Oh no, that missile's going to fall on us? No, the missile was knocked off. But what if Iron Dome doesn't work that way? What if Iron Dome goes up and it just puts like a bubble over Sderot? So shkoach, right now the bubble's holding strong. But everyone in Sderot still knows those missiles are just waiting to fall. Gravity's going to bring them down. As soon as that bubble gets weaker, those missiles are going to fall. They're still going to need to build bomb shelters in Sderot because they're going to say, who says that that bubble is going to last forever? That's the mashal the parable, how I would explain this. So that's what the Taz is saying. Noach would have said as follows. The way I understand how it's tzaddik and 10 tzaddikim, how they can stop a decree of destruction, it's not that it permanently disables it. It's not Iron Dome going off and knocking off the missile. We provide a bubble, a protective bubble. But who says that's going to last? What happens in the next generation if they slip? If someone else makes a mistake? And eventually what's going to happen? The flood's going to come. And if that happens, we have to prepare for that. So we still got to build the arks. That's how the Taz wants to answer this. Very interesting. So he says, Noach would have said, listen, at some point humanity might fail and that decree might have to kick in. I at least want to save my family. And I've got hundreds of years. If he started having kids at 100, so he would have had, for the next 400 years, there would have been his kids, grandkids, and however many generations till the day Noach died. So Noach would have spent the rest of his life, hundreds of years, building tevas. Because he says, he still would have wanted his family to be protected, even if they would have messed up. He loves his family. So he would have wanted to build for them. And therefore, if he would have had 400 years worth of kids, he would have had to build a whole lot of boats, a whole armada, a huge fleet of ships to make sure everyone could be saved. So look at that. I thought that was fascinating. A very, very different answer. Very different answer, which just changes our perception that there's more than one way to look at it. When there's a tzaddik, when this idea that that a gzeira ra, that a decree of destruction was averted, it doesn't necessarily mean it was destroyed. It might mean it was temporarily deflected. Very interesting. So Noah says it. So I still need a plan for the worst case scenario. What happens if people mess up? The flood's coming, and now it's going to require tevas harbe, many ships. I thought that was fascinating. So two very different answers. I want to share with you a third answer that takes a completely different track. So this third answer is by one of our Rishonim, the Chizkuni. The Chizkuni saw Rashi. He lived after Rashi. He saw Rashi quoted the Medrash, and you could tell when you see. If I just saw this Chizkuni, I don't know, and I just saw Rashi, I don't know if I would have fully appreciated. Now that I saw what those commentaries asked on Rashi, which was quoting the Medrash, and how they answered it, now I have a whole new appreciation for this Chizkuni. That's why I want to share this with you. I thought this is why. Look what the Chizkuni says. The Chizkuni says, "V'yehi Noach ben chamesh meos," that Noach, when he was 500 years old, vayilod. That's when he and his wife started having kids. So he totally changes it. He says it's not that God wouldn't let them have kids for the first 400 years. Rather, he says, Yodim hayu. Noach and his wife knew. They had a tradition. Yodim hayu, they knew Shamabel hayas lavo. They knew a storm was coming. Kemoshe perish Rashi gabe nishe lemech. Rashi alluded to this earlier when he told us about one of Noach's ancestors, whose name was Lemech. Lemech had two wives, and Lemech's wives, they didn't want to have children with him because they understood that at a certain point there was going to be a flood. I'm sorry again, I don't know if Lemech was one of Noach's ancestors. I think Noach was a descendant of Shes. Lemech was from a different line. Lemech was from one of Cain's kids. So I don't know if I should say that Lemech was an ancestor of Noach. So I believe Lemech was a descendant of Cain, and that whole branch gets knocked off. Noach was a descendant of Shes. So I shouldn't be so fast to say Lemech was an ancestor of Noach. But whatever, it was definitely a previous generation, and there was a tradition that was out there that there was going to be a flood, the world was going to be wiped out. Noach caught wind of this. So it says Noach and his wife, they somehow or another, they abstained for 400 years. The first 400 years of their marriage, they abstained from having children. Because they were nervous. We're going to bring our kids and their kids and the next generation into this world, and they're going to all be destroyed. Until the Chizkuni says, God made some kind of guarantee to Noach that says, it's okay, I'm going to take care of you and your family. At that point, Noach and Mrs. Noach, whose name was Nama, that's when they start having children. But look how what he's doing here. He's taking a completely different route. Rashi was working with the Medrash Rabbah that says, why didn't Noach have kids and his wife have kids the first 400 years of their marriage? God didn't let them. God in his hashkacha, God in his intervention, didn't let Noach and Naamah have kids for the first 400 years of their marriage. It was all on God. What was God's calculation? If they're Rishoim, if they're evil, they're going to get knocked off. If they're tzaddikim, then they're going to have to build so many ships. I don't want to bother him with that. That was the Medrash Rabbah's approach. And then you have the question, okay, what if they're tzaddikim? There shouldn't be a flood. Two different answers. We saw Sifsei Chachamim and we saw the Divrei Torah. The Cheskuni has a whole different approach. Why didn't they have kids the first 400 years of their marriage? They abstained. Noach and Naamah, they abstained from one another because they were nervous to have children. It's not that God stepped in and if they're Rishoim, they're going to get knocked off. If they're tzaddikim, have to build many boats. And now you have to answer, well, why would they have to build many boats? The Cheskuni avoids that whole thing because he says it wasn't God, it was Noach and Naamah. They took matters in their own hands. They said, we don't feel safe having children. So it wasn't until God speaks to Noach and says, I'll look after you, that's when they start having kids. The downside of this Cheskuni is nowhere in the Torah does it say anything about God speaking to Noach before those kids were born. God only speaks to Noach after Shem, Cham, and Yafes are on the scene. And he says, I see that they're tzaddikim, and he says to him, okay, I'm going to destroy the world, build a boat for you and your family. According to this Cheskuni, it sounds like Noach had some kind of communication with God, guaranteeing his safety before the kids were born. It was based on that communication that they went ahead and had the kids. Again, so the Cheskuni is going to have to say, okay, that happened. Torah just didn't record it for. I don't know what he's going to do there, but I'm just showing that's the downside of that. So while he does avoid the question that everybody asks on this medrash quoted by Rashi, is not necessarily out of the woods because there's a question you could ask on him. I thought this was just fascinating. And this is an aspect, again, I was not familiar with. I want to share with you one other item on this Rashi, is that if you know, on the Pasuk rather, look what the Pasuk says. Every time the Torah refers to Noach's kids, it does it in this order. It says Shem, Cham, and Yafes. Pasuk Lamed Beis, it says Vayehi Noach ben Chamesh Me'el Shana, Vayole Noach es Shem, es Cham, es Yafes. That's the order. So I just assume that's the order they're born. Shem, the original Semite, right? Shem, and then Cham, and then Yafes. What did Rashi tell us though? Rashi said at the end of that first Rashi, who was the oldest of the kids? Yafes. It says by the time the flood came, Yafes wasn't 100 years old yet. So Yafes is the oldest of the kids. So let's look at the next Rashi on this pasuk. Rashi's bothered by this. If Yafes is the oldest kid, why is the order always Shem, Cham, and Yafes? Yafes is the oldest. Why is he listed last? So let's see this next Rashi. Hashem es Cham es Yafes. And in this week's parsha, you see it listed that way also. It says Valo Yafes hu agaro, but we just said Yafes is the oldest. Why is he listed last? Ela betchila atadoresh Hashem shehu tzaddik. He says, you know what? Shem is always going to get listed first because Shem was a tzaddik. Shem was the most righteous, and Shem's going to be the one who always gets listed first. But that's just the way it goes. Okay. So why is Shem first? How do I know he's a tzaddik? Because it says Nolad Kishumo. He was also another big thing going for him is that the sages tell us in the Medrash that he was born, he already had a bris milah. He was born without a foreskin. There was something really special about Shem. From the day he was born, he had something going for him. He didn't have his foreskin. He was like born complete. So he was a tzaddik and he was born complete. So that's why Shem's listed first. And a third thing going for Shem is one of his illustrious great-grandchildren was Avram Avinu. So Shem is listed first for three reasons. Number one, he was a tzaddik. Number two, he was really special. He was born already with a bris milah. He did not have an orla. He did not have a foreskin. And number three, Avram is his descendant. So that's why Shem is listed first. So I saw this Rashi and I said, Shkoach, very nice. So I understand why Shem is listed first. But now if I had to write the order, what should the order be in my book? It should be Shem Yafes Cham. It should be Shem Yafes Cham. Because Yafes is the oldest. So we said, okay, Shem has to be first because Shem's the most righteous. Great. Okay, so put Shem first. But now put Yafes. So it should be Shem Yafes Cham. So I saw the Sifsei Chachamim was bothered by this. So the Sifsei Chachamim says, B'tchila Doresh. So he says, B'kasha, Lachshov, Yefes, Acher Shem. So he says, why don't you stick? So, okay, you have to put Shem first, but now put Yefes. So he says, Yesh Lomar, what's his answer? We don't want to deviate so much. In other words, the true order should have been Yefes, Shem, and Yefes, Chum, Shem. Because the real order was Yefes was the oldest, and then it always goes Shem, Chum. So it should have been Yefes, Shem, Chum. That's what the order should have been. And now what are you saying we should do? Put Shem first because he's a tzaddik, and then it should be Shem, Yefes, Chum. What? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. It should have been Yefes Shem Cham, and now you want to make it to Shem Yefes Cham. You're totally switching things up. Ki Shem v'Cham noldim b'zachar zeh. The order was Shem was born and then Cham. In other words, the real order was Yefes, Shem, and then Cham. So Shem was born before Cham. So you want to break it up now to say, okay, Shem has to be first, but then Yefes. Now you're totally changing things. There's no symbolism of the correct order. You're going to make it that it was Shem, Yefes, Cham. The real order was Yefes. I'm sorry. You want to go. You want to go Shem, Yefes, Cham. That's how you want to do it. That's not the order at all. The real order was Yefes, Shem, Cham. And if you want to go Shem, Yefes, Cham, you just changed everything. So it's better to do what? It's better, mishmachi lo ratz lafsik. That's what they don't want to break it up. So it's better to do what? To say Shem, Cham, Yafes. Put Yafes, knock Yafes to last. Why is Yafes last? Because Cham always goes after Shem. So even though Yafes was the oldest, Yafes can't go first because Shem has to go first. So put Yafes in the middle. No. Cham always goes after Shem because that's the order they were born. So we at least want to keep some order. So Shem and Cham go in that order, and Yafes will be last. That's how he's answering this. In my mind, this was such a good illustration of, we know there's a concept called Tov l'tzadik, Tov l'shcheno, is that when we hang around a tzaddik, we benefit. When we hang around someone who's righteous, we end up being lifted in the process. And this is a great example of that. Because here's Cham. There's no reason why Cham should have been second. Yefes should have been second, because Yefes was the oldest who got demoted. The only reason Cham is listed second is because that was the order of events. He's kind of linked with Shem. So here is Cham getting elevated for no reason other than the fact that, he always goes as a team together with Shem. So it's always an important idea. Tov l'tzadik, tov l'shcheno. Pick our company wisely. Who is it? Sometimes we have shows at tzaddik, we'll rise to the occasion. The flip side is we say, oy l'rasha, oy l'shcheno. If we associate ourselves with a rasha, with someone who's wicked, we get dragged down in the process. So let's always associate with someone who's righteous. That's what totally pays. I want to share one more thought with you. And this one, we'll talk it out. We're not going to see it all inside. This is in Parshas Noach, when it's listing all the animals that Noach and his wife and family bring into the Teva. So it's in chapter 7, that's Perek Zayin, Psukim Zayin and Ches. It says, Vayivon Noach ubanav v'ishto u'neshei banav yito el ha'teva mipnei mei hamabel. The whole family, the whole kid and caboodle, they go into the ark because of the waters of the flood are rising. Ches. And they brought all the animals. Mina behema tahora. They brought the pure, the animals that are clean, meaning that are going to be designated as kosher. Umina behema, I have it bolded, asher einena tahora, that are not tahar. If you were writing this book, and the Torah, the style of this pasuk is setting up a contrast, what would you have written? It says mina behema tahora. What's the contrast? What's the opposite of tahora? Timeya. Very good, Layla. Timeya means impure or not kosher. But what did the pasuk do? It says from the animals that are tahara and the animals that are not tahar. That's bizarre. Say the animals that are tahara and the animals that are tameya. What's going on? So the Gemara picks up on this on page 3. The Gemara in Pesachim says, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. La'olam, a general principle is al yotze adam davar meguna mipiv. Nobody should ever let crude expressions or words slip from their mouth. Sharei ikem akasur shmona osios. The Torah went out of its way to distort things and add an extra 8 letters in the Torah, v'lohotzi davar meguna mipiv, so as not to say something that was crude. Shenamar, because what are the pasuk? Look what the letters that the Torah could have said. It said hatmeya. If it could have said hatmeya. We said Noah took the animals that were, and then it could have said hatmeya. Tmeya is only 5 letters, right? You see it? Hey, tes, mem, aleph, hey. Hatmeya is only is only 5 letters. That's what they could have said. But instead, the Torah wrote Asher Einena Tehora. That's 13 letters. If you subtract 5 from 13, you end up with 8. So there are 8 extra letters in the Torah because the Torah wanted to speak in a refined fashion. The Torah wanted to teach us this lesson that, there's many places in the Torah where it says the expression Tmeya. But it took out one spot to avoid using the expression Tmeya, and it should catch our attention. And we should learn from this, that if we have a choice to speak in a refined manner, this isn't even talking about swearing. This isn't even talking about being in the gutter and using filthy words. This isn't talking about using explicit language that, the hip hop stars, love using. It's nothing about that. It's just using something that's not refined. It's crude. It's that type of an expression. Avoid it. Speak in a refined manner because we are human beings. We're created b'tselem Elokim in God's image. Speak in a refined manner. And by the Torah using this lengthier expression, use an extra 8 letters when the Torah is always so careful not to do anything extra. So that teaches us this lesson. I have there in the, you'll see an article that I wrote close to a year ago after a great Talmud Chacham in Chicago, Illinois passed away. Rav Gedalia Dov Schwartz Zatzal passed away. It was a rabbi that I had a close relationship with, and he actually was a childhood friend of Rav Nata Greenblatt. They grew up together in Newark, New Jersey. The last time I saw him, I visited him. It was after we had moved already to Memphis, and I saw him in Chicago, and he wanted to know how his childhood friend Rav Nata was doing. They grew up together in Newark, New Jersey. I think Rav Schwartz was just a year or so older than Rav Nata. He passed away last year on Erev Hanukkah, really the day going into Hanukkah. And after he passed away, I wrote an article thinking about many of my thoughts and some of the experiences I had with him. There's a link to the article. You can click it. I put the link in the source sheet. I thought it was a good article, and I thought it really helped me go through some of my memories and think about what I appreciated about Rav Schwartz so much. One item that I brought down in that article, I want to just share with you. And again, I'm not going to read it inside. It's on the source sheet. I was once talking to him. I'd called him up about a very, very tricky situation that had come up when we lived in Pennsylvania. I'd called him up about, I don't want to get into the specifics. It was a very complicated case concerning someone in the community, a Jewish man who was married to a non-Jewish woman. And a very thorny issue had come up as a result of that, and something that had happened in Shul. Without going into specifics, I called him up for some guidance. And in the course of conversation, I used an expression that I hadn't really thought about. It came out instinctively. When I was referring to this fellow, I said, there's a fellow in the shul, and he's married to a shiksa. That was the word that I said. I had heard it so many times growing up. It's a Yiddish word that had often been used in conversations to talk about that someone would talk about a non-Jewish woman. He stopped me right there on the spot before getting to any further in the conversation. And he says to me, he goes, Rabbi Males, he says, he was very formal, says to me, that is not a refined word. I said, excuse me, I'm sorry, what did I say? So he says, you used the term shiksa. That's a very a derogatory term. And when you were talking about his Gentile spouse, his wife that's not Jewish, you can search high and low in rabbinic literature. You will never find that term used. The term that was always used to refer to a non-Jewish woman will be a nachris, a nachriya, or a goya, someone who's not Jewish. That's a respectable term. But to say shiksa, that's a degrading, that's a demeaning term. You shouldn't use it. That's not for anything that a rabbi should be using. It's not something that another Jew should be using. You really should speak in a more refined manner. And I stopped. I said, Rav Schwartz, I thank you very much. I never had thought about that. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you very much for pointing that out to me. And I made a concerted effort ever since then to take that word out of my vocabulary. It's not a swear word. It's not something that's vulgar. But he was saying it's not refined. It's degrading. It's demeaning. It's not something that someone who's refined and someone who's trying to be an exemplar of proper behavior, it's not a way you should be speaking. That's what he told me. And I thanked him. And I said, when I hung up the phone, I felt like I was a better person. He just gave me some good constructive advice about something I could do to come off as a better person and present myself better, and really to be a more respectful person. I try to make a point of teaching this, sharing this lesson with high school kids I teach every year. I just found this. Look in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. They actually have the word shiksa there. And they actually say in there that it's disparaging, often disparaging of a non-Jewish girl or woman, or a second usage could be talking about a Jewish girl or woman who doesn't observe Jewish precepts, used especially by Orthodox Jews. Oy. So here it is. It's saying that it's a disparaging term, and that Orthodox Jews use. What's the source of it, by the way, is in Sefer Vayikra, when it talks about animals that are not kosher. It says, look there in Pasuk Yud on the last sheet, talking about fish that don't have scales, both scales and fins. It should be considered an abomination. In the next pasuk. So that word sheketz means it's something that like you should consider gross, stay away from. So it seems like at some point in Yiddish history and in culture, you got to remember, Jews were for thousands of years, especially in Christian Europe, Jews were on the side of being the victim. Jews were the ones who were being oppressed. They didn't have much of a way to fight back against the majority Christian society that was pushing them down. One of the only ways that Jews could fight back was with their words, was to figure out some way to refer to those who were oppressing us. So what becomes used is to refer to a male, a non-Jewish male that was oppressing us, was a shegetz. That's the male, that's the lashon zachar. That's the male way to say, oh, that abomination, that disgusting one. That was the non-Jewish man who was oppressing us. And the woman was a shiksa, was the one who was the abomination who was oppressing us. That's how this all started. This became in Yiddish culture, but it had to do with the fact that we were oppressed, and there was no way we could physically fight back. The one way we could fight back was in the words that we used, that in referring to them in our own language that they didn't understand. And now it's somehow or another, with time, it crept out of that usage. It just became used. Okay, that's the word you use when you're referring to a non-Jewish man was a shegetz and a non-Jewish woman was a shiksa. That was the words that we used, but it's disparaging. It's not nice. And that's what Rav Schwartz was telling me. He says, get that out of your vocabulary. That's not a respectful way to speak. That's not refined. Don't use those. And I since then, I've been trying to make an effort not to. So that's a lesson that comes up in Parshas Noach. The Torah went out of its way. It used the term that was 8 letters longer to teach us this lesson, that we're Tzelem Elokim, we're human beings created in God's image. We should be careful about the words that come out of our mouth. Of course, we're not going to use vulgarities. Of course, we're not going to swear. We're not using something that's explicit. We're not talking like we're in a hip hop video, but even the words we choose that are not vulgar, that are not explicit, let's speak in a refined manner, not in a crude manner. That's a lesson from Parshas Noach. That's something that Rabbi Schwartz taught me. And I've tried to make part of my life, part of my world. And every year when Parshas Noach comes around, I think of that.